The marble floor of the penthouse was freezing, but it was nothing compared to the ice in her new husband's voice. "Keep your distance," he ordered, not even looking at her as he unfastened his platinum Patek Philippe watch. "This ring is a business transaction, nothing more. Do not expect a husband." That was their wedding night. 3 months later, that same ruthless Mafia king tore apart half of New York City just to breathe in her scent, violently refusing to let her go. The scent of thousands of white lilies was supposed to symbolize purity and new beginnings. Instead, to Genevieve Rossi, they smelled like a funeral. Standing at the altar of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, she felt the crushing weight of her custom Vera Wang gown, heavily embroidered with crystals that caught the flashing lights of the press outside. Beside her stood Matteo Falcone. At 32, Matteo was a phantom in the New York underworld, a man whose legitimate empire in commercial real estate was only a shiny veneer over the Falcone syndicate, the most feared crime family on the eastern seaboard. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, jawline cut like glass, and eyes the color of a storm over the Atlantic. But he was also terrifying. Genevieve's father, Morgan Rossi, had brokered this marriage to settle a massive territorial dispute and a debt of $20 million. Genevieve was the collateral. She was 24, educated in Switzerland, fluent in 3 languages, and entirely aware that she had just been sold to a monster. Throughout the extravagant reception at the Plaza Hotel, Matteo barely touched her. When they posed for photographs, his hand rested on the small of her back, a grip that was firm, possessive, yet entirely devoid of warmth. He spoke to her only when necessary, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent a mixture of fear and an inexplicable, annoying shiver down her spine. "Smile for the Governor, Genevieve," he murmured in her ear as a high-ranking politician approached their table. "We are playing a part today." "I am perfectly aware of my role, Matteo," she replied, her voice steady, flashing a radiant, practiced smile at the governor. Matteo's eyes flicked to hers, a momentary spark of surprise hidden beneath his stoic facade. He was used to women who either feared him into silence or fawned over him for his wealth. Genevieve's icy composure was not what he had expected from a Mafia princess. By midnight, the armored Maybach pulled up to an exclusive residential skyscraper in Tribeca. The ride up the private elevator to the penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. Genevieve stared at the changing numbers on the digital display, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The wedding was a public spectacle. The penthouse was their reality. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a sprawling minimalist fortress in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Hudson River, the city lights reflecting off the dark water. The decor was cold black marble, dark leather, brushed steel. It looked exactly like the man who owned it. Genevieve stood in the center of the living room, the long train of her dress pooled around her. She waited for him to say something, to offer a drink, to lay down the ground rules. Matteo walked to the wet bar, pouring himself 2 fingers of Macallan 25. He didn't pour one for her. He took a slow sip, his dark eyes finally locking onto hers from across the room. The silence stretched thick and heavy. "Let's get one thing straight. Genevieve Matteo," finally, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. He set the crystal glass down with a soft clink and unfastened his watch, placing it on the counter. "This marriage exists on paper and in the eyes of the 5 families. It ensures your father keeps his knees intact, and it consolidates the Brooklyn ports under my name." Genevieve kept her chin high. "I know what this is." "Do you?" He took a few slow steps toward her, stopping a few feet away. His height was imposing, casting a long shadow over her. "Then know this. I didn't want a wife. I do not have the time nor the inclination to play house. You will have a limitless black Amex, a driver, and a security detail. You can decorate the East Wing however you please. But beyond these walls we are business partners. Inside them, we are strangers. He leaned in slightly, his scent, cedar wood, expensive tobacco, and rain washing over her. Keep your distance. Do not ask questions about my work, do not wait up for me, and do not expect me in your bed. Understood. Anger flared in Genevieve's chest, hot and bright. She had expected a cold marriage, but his dismissive arrogance was infuriating. She wasn't a porcelain doll to be placed on a shelf and forgotten. She took a deliberate step forward, entirely closing the gap he had tried to maintain. She saw his jaw clench as she tilted her head to look him dead in the eye. Understood perfectly, she said, her voice dripping with refined velvet. And for the record, Matteo, the feeling is entirely mutual. I agreed to this to save my father, not to seek your affection. I prefer my distance. Just make sure your enemies don't mistake your neglect for a weakness they can exploit. With that, Genevieve turned on her heel, lifting the heavy skirts of her Vera Wang gown, and marched down the long hallway towards the East Wing. She didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen Matteo Falcone standing perfectly still, his dark eyes tracking her every movement, a strange, unreadable expression hardening on his face. The first 2 months of their marriage were a masterclass in psychological warfare. True to his word, Matteo kept his distance, but the reality of living in a 10,000-square-foot penthouse meant their orbits inevitably collided. Genevieve quickly established her own routine. She refused to be a gilded prisoner. She spent her mornings running on the treadmill in the penthouse gym, her afternoons managing her own philanthropic foundation, and her evenings reading complex geopolitical and financial literature in the library. She noticed early on that Matteo was an observer. He would sit in the dining room, dressed impeccably in bespoke Brioni suits, sipping espresso from the La Marzocco machine, hiding behind the Financial Times. But he was always watching her. Genevieve made a point to be entirely self-sufficient. She didn't ask him for money, utilizing her own family trust. She didn't ask for his time. If they happened to be in the kitchen at the same time, she would offer a polite, detached nod, as one might greet a distant colleague in a corporate hallway. The silence began to grate on Matteo. He was a man who commanded entire rooms with a single look. Men trembled when he walked into his illegal underground casinos in Queens, yet his own wife treated him like an inconvenience. He found himself intentionally leaving his study door cracked open, just to hear the soft padding of her bare feet on the hardwood floors, or lingering by the foyer when her security detail brought her home from lunch at Cipriani's. The shift began during week 7. The Falcone Syndicate was hosting a high-stakes charity gala at the Pierre Hotel. It was a thinly veiled gathering of the East Coast's most dangerous power players. Genevieve wore a backless emerald-green silk gown that clung to her curves like liquid glass, her dark hair swept up, revealing the elegant slope of her neck. When she descended the penthouse staircase, Matteo actually stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. He quickly masked it with a scowl, offering his arm without a word. At the gala, they played their parts flawlessly. They smiled for the cameras. He held her waist. She rested her hand on his chest. It was a perfectly choreographed lie. Halfway through the evening, Matteo was pulled away by his underboss. Genevieve found herself standing near the Champagne Tower when Lorenzo Costa approached her. Costa was a ruthless mid-level boss from the Miami faction, a man who had been heavily encroaching on the Rossi family's old shipping routes. Mrs. Aho Sorsudia, Falcone Costa purred, his eyes raking over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. Or should I say, little Rossi. It's a shame your father had to sell his prized jewel just to keep his boats afloat. Genevieve took a slow sip of her champagne, her face a mask of supreme indifference. Mr. Costa, I'm surprised you had the funds to fly up from Florida. I heard the SEC froze 3 of your offshore shell companies last Tuesday. Costa's smug smile faltered. His face flushed a dark, angry red. Watch your mouth, little girl. Falcone might own you now, but your father's territory down south is bleeding. It would be a shame if one of his warehouses caught fire next week. Genevieve stepped closer to Costa, her voice dropping to a dangerous, silken whisper. She didn't know that Matteo had returned and was standing just on the other side of a marble pillar, perfectly positioned to hear every word. If a single ember touches a Rossi warehouse, Mr. Alabo Abeneda, Costa Genevieve said, her tone lethal. I will personally ensure the federal authorities receive the ledger containing the real estate laundering scheme you've been running out of Brickell Avenue, the one tied to your mistress's maiden name. I suggest you go back to Miami and focus on your own leaks. Now excuse me. Costa turned pale, stammering, completely dismantled. Genevieve turned and walked away, her emerald dress trailing behind her. Behind the pillar, Matteo stood, frozen. His jaw was tight, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. She knew about Brickell Avenue. Even his own intelligence network had only just uncovered Costa's Florida laundering scheme. On the armored Maybach ride back to Tribeca, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick. The usual cold distance felt different tonight. It felt heavy, charged. Matteo sat in the dim light of the back seat, his eyes burning into the side of her profile as she stared out the window at the passing neon lights of Times Square. You threatened Lorenzo Costa, Matteo said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Genevieve didn't look at him. I educated him. There is a difference. You shouldn't involve yourself in syndicate business. He threatened my family's warehouses. She snapped, finally turning to face him, her eyes flashing with defiance. I won't stand by and play the silent, decorative wife while a bottom feeder like Costa thinks he can intimidate me. Matteo shifted in his leather seat, leaning closer to her. The space between them evaporated. And the ledger on Brickell Avenue. How did you know about that? Genevieve gave him a sharp, mocking smile. Keep your distance, Matteo. Isn't that what you ordered? My sources are my own. Matteo's hand shot out in the darkness, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around her wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to send a shockwave of heat straight up her arm. Genevieve gasped, her eyes widening, as he pulled her slightly closer. Do not play games with me. Genevieve, he murmured, his voice a dark, dangerous rumble. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. Costa is a violent man. If he thinks you are a threat, I am a threat, she whispered fiercely, refusing to pull her hand away. To anyone who thinks I am weak. For a long moment, Matteo just stared at her, his breathing shallow. He realized in that suffocatingly close second that he didn't want to let go of her wrist. The ice he had meticulously built between them was cracking not under the weight of his power, but under the sheer force of her fire. He abruptly released her and turned away, adjusting his cuffs. Tomorrow I am doubling your security detail. You do not go anywhere without 3 men. Genevieve rolled her eyes, turning back to the window. As you wish, boss. She missed the way his fists clenched in his lap, or the way he watched her reflection in the glass for the rest of the ride home. Month 3 began with a torrential downpour that didn't let up for 5 days. The storm over New York City mirrored the storm brewing inside the penthouse. The dynamic had fundamentally changed. Matteo was no longer ignoring Genevieve. He was stalking her. He knew what time she woke up. He knew she preferred her tea at precisely 4 lire p.m. And he knew that she liked to read on the velvet sofa by the window when it rained. He found himself leaving his syndicate meetings early, snapping at his underbosses, his mind entirely consumed by the woman walking around his home like a ghost he couldn't catch. Genevieve felt the weight of his gaze. Every time she looked up, he was there, watching. When she walked past him in the hallway, the air between them practically hummed with electricity. She told herself she hated him, hated his arrogance and his rules, but her heart betrayed her every time she heard his heavy footsteps approaching. It all came to a violent head on a rainy Tuesday evening. Genevieve had insisted on attending a private art gallery opening in Chelsea. Matteo had strictly forbidden her to go citing rising tensions with a Russian faction operating out of Brighton Beach. Genevieve, stubborn and suffocated by the penthouse, had simply waited until he left for a sit-down in New Jersey, gathered her 3 massive bodyguards and went anyway. The gallery was a minimalist space on 24th Street, showcasing contemporary works. Genevieve was examining a massive canvas of abstract blues and greys, sipping sparkling water, trying to ignore the gnawing guilt of defying Matteo's direct order. At 8:45 p.m., the glass front doors of the gallery shattered. The sound of suppressed gunfire was like a series of violent, heavy coughs. Genevieve's lead bodyguard, a giant of a man named Rocco, tackled her to the polished concrete floor just as the drywall behind her exploded into dust. Screams erupted. Genevieve hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Her ears rang. "Move, move, move!" Rocco roared, dragging her by her arm toward the rear exit. The other 2 guards returned fire, their weapons flashing in the dim gallery lighting. Genevieve's mind went blank with terror, but her body moved on instinct. She scrambled in her heels, her heart clawing at her throat. They burst through the steel back door into a dark, rain-soaked alleyway, but 2 masked men in black tactical gear were already waiting for them in the alley. Rocco stepped in front of Genevieve, raising his weapon, but a shot rang out from the street end of the alley. It didn't come from the masked men. A black SUV had mounted the curb, its headlights blinding in the rain. Before the vehicle even fully stopped, the door was kicked open. Matteo Falcone stepped into the rain. He didn't look like a businessman tonight. He looked like the devil himself. He held a customized Sig Sauer in his hand, his eyes completely black with murderous rage. With ruthless, terrifying precision, he fired twice. Both masked men dropped to the wet pavement instantly. Genevieve Matteo's roar echoed over the thunder. She broke away from Rocco, stumbling forward in the rain, her heels slipping on the wet cobblestone. Before she could fall, Matteo caught her. He dropped his weapon, wrapping both of his massive arms around her, crushing her against his wet suit. His chest was heaving, his heart pounding so hard against her cheek it felt like a hammer. He buried his face in her wet, dark hair, breathing her in as if she were oxygen. And he had been drowning for 3 months. "Matteo!" She gasped, her hands gripping the lapels of his ruined Tom Ford suit. "Are you hit? Did they touch you?" he demanded, pulling back just enough to aggressively scan her body. His large hands roamed rapidly over her arms, her shoulders, her waist, frantic and desperate, checking for blood. "No, I'm okay. I'm not hurt," she stammered, entirely overwhelmed by the raw, unhinged emotion radiating off him. This wasn't the cold, calculated Mafia king. This was a man completely undone. Matteo gripped the sides of her face, his thumbs gently wiping the rainwater and mascara from her cheeks. His hands were shaking. Matteo Falcone's hands were shaking. "I told you not to come here," he gritted out his voice, cracking with a terrifying mix of anger and terror. "I told you. I didn't think You didn't think, he snarled, pulling her flush against his chest again. If I had lost you tonight, Genevieve, I swear to God, I would have burned this entire city to the ground. Every street, every building. He shoved her into the back of the SUV, climbing in right on top of her as the driver slammed the gas, speeding away from the sirens wailing in the distance. In the dim enclosed space of the back seat, the adrenaline spiked. Genevieve was shaking violently, the shock finally setting in. Matteo didn't sit on his side of the car. He pulled her onto his lap. "Matteo, your rules," she whispered, her voice trembling, trying weakly to put a hand against his chest to maintain the distance he had originally commanded. "Fuck the rules," he growled, grabbing her hand and pressing it flat against his racing heart. "Fuck the distance." He didn't give her a chance to speak. Matteo crashed his mouth down onto hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was possessive bruising, and desperate, a violent claiming that shattered every wall he had built between them. Genevieve whimpered, her hands tangling in his wet hair as she kissed him back with equal ferocity. 3 months of repressed tension, anger, and undeniable attraction exploded in the back of the armored car. He tasted like rain adrenaline and dark obsession. His hands gripped her waist, hauling her closer, leaving no space for air between them. When he finally pulled back, they were both gasping. His forehead rested against hers, his dark eyes blazing with a feral intensity. "Try to keep your distance now, Genevieve," he breathed against her swollen lips, his thumb tracing her jawline with dangerous reverence. "See what happens. Because I am never letting you go." The subterranean parking garage of the Tribeca high-rise was a fortress of concrete and steel, but to Genevieve, it felt like the antechamber to a different world. The moment the armored Maybach screeched to a halt, Matteo practically tore the heavy door open. He didn't wait for Rocco or the other surviving guards to clear the perimeter. He reached into the back seat, hauled Genevieve out by her waist, and carried her toward the private elevator, as if she weighed absolutely nothing. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his bespoke Tom Ford suit was ruined, stained with rainwater and the blood of the men he had just slaughtered in the alleyway. But Matteo didn't care. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his dark eyes fixed solely on the digital display of the elevator as it shot upward. Genevieve was trembling, the lingering adrenaline crashing violently through her veins. She kept her hands pressed flat against his chest, feeling the frantic, violent rhythm of his heart. She had spent 3 months believing this man felt nothing for her, that she was merely a chess piece in a $20 million transaction. But the man holding her now was entirely unhinged. When the elevator doors parted, revealing the silent, dimly lit penthouse, Matteo didn't set her down. He strode through the massive living room, his heavy footsteps echoing against the black marble, and bypassed the east wing entirely. He carried her directly into the master suite, his sanctuary, a room she had never been permitted to enter. He kicked the heavy oak door shut behind them, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Finally, he lowered her to her feet, though he didn't release his grip on her waist. He crowded her against the heavy mahogany door, his massive frame trapping her completely. "Look at me," Matteo commanded, his voice a raw, gravelly rasp. Genevieve lifted her chin, her breathing shallow as she met his stormy gaze. "I'm fine, Matteo. I told you they didn't touch me." "They shot at you," he snarled, the memory flashing behind his eyes, turning them pitch black. "They fired weapons at my wife. If Rocco hadn't pulled you down—" He stopped, squeezing his eyes shut, as a visceral shudder ripped through his broad shoulders. When he opened them again, the raw vulnerability in his expression completely disarmed her. "You ordered me to keep my distance," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You told me to live my life, and you would live yours. I was a fool." Matteo breathed, his hands sliding up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the high arches of her cheekbones. "I thought I could keep you at arm's length. I thought if I didn't touch you, I wouldn't ruin you. In this life, Genevieve, everything I love becomes a target. I wanted to keep you safe from my world." By locking me in a tower and ignoring me, she challenged, though the fire in her tone was softened by the tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "By denying myself the only thing I have ever truly wanted," he confessed, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "The first time I saw you at the Rossi estate negotiating trade routes with your father, I knew you were going to be my undoing. I bought your father's debt, Genevieve. I didn't marry you to settle a dispute. I orchestrated the entire dispute so I could have you." Genevieve's breath hitched in her throat. The territorial war, the $20 million, the sudden arranged marriage, it had all been a calculated manipulation by the Mafia king to claim her. She should have been furious. She should have pushed him away and slapped his aristocratic face. Instead, a dark, thrilling warmth spread through her chest. Before she could process the magnitude of his confession, Matteo's lips crashed down onto hers again. This time it wasn't a desperate claim born of adrenaline. It was a deep, punishing surrender. He kissed her as if he were dying and she was the only cure. His tongue swept into her mouth, tasting of rain scotch and unfiltered desire. Genevieve melted against him, her hands sliding under his ruined suit jacket, her fingers tracing the hard, scarred planes of his chest through his damp dress shirt. She felt him groan against her mouth, a low, guttural sound of pure submission. He swept her up into his arms again, carrying her toward the massive California king bed in the center of the room. That night, the cold, silent war between them was violently dismantled. Matteo worshipped every inch of her skin, proving with his hands and his mouth what he had refused to say with words for 3 torturous months. There was no distance left. By the time the sun began to rise over the Hudson River, casting a pale golden glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Genevieve lay tangled in the silk sheets, her head resting on Matteo's chest as he absent-mindedly stroked her dark hair. But the peace was a fleeting illusion. At 7:00 a.m., the encrypted phone on Matteo's nightstand vibrated violently. The softness in Matteo's eyes vanished in an instant, replaced by the lethal calculating stare of the syndicate boss. He answered the phone, listening in stony silence for 30 seconds. "Keep him in the basement at the Brooklyn Navy Yard." Matteo ordered, his voice cold and devoid of any humanity. "Do not let him pass out. I am on my way." He hung up the phone and slipped out of bed, his naked, heavily scarred back facing her, as he walked toward the walk-in closet. "What is it?" Genevieve asked, pulling the silk sheet up over her breasts. Matteo paused, turning to look at her. The sight of his wife in his bed, marked by his touches, sent a fierce surge of possessiveness through his veins. "My men captured the driver of the SUV that dropped those shooters at the gallery. He's Russian. Brighton Beach faction." Victor Rostova, Genevieve murmured, recognizing the name from her geopolitical studies of the city's underground. "Why would the Russians break the treaty?" "Your families have had a ceasefire for 5 years. Matteo began pulling on a fresh pair of charcoal slacks and a black button-down shirt. He strapped a custom leather shoulder holster over his chest, sliding the heavy Sig Sauer into place. "Because someone paid them to break it. Someone who wants me distracted or dead. I'm going to find out who." He walked back to the bed, leaning down to press a hard, lingering kiss to her lips. "You are not to leave this penthouse, Genevieve. Rocco and a heavily armed detail will be outside the door. Do not test me on this. Until Rostova is handled, this building is on lockdown." Genevieve watched him walk out the heavy oak door, clicking shut behind him. She sat alone in the massive master suite, her mind racing. Matteo thought he could protect her by locking her away again, this time with a golden padlock instead of a cold shoulder. But Genevieve Rossi was raised by wolves. She knew how to hunt. She threw off the sheets and walked to the closet. If a war was coming to their doorstep, she refused to wait blindly for the casualties. The basement of the Brooklyn Navy Yard smelled of rust-damp concrete and the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. Matteo stood with his arms crossed the sleeves of his black shirt, rolled up to the elbows, exposing the intricate black ink of the Falcone Syndicate tattooed on his forearms. In front of him, strapped to a heavy steel chair, was a bruised and battered man in his early 30s. The Russian driver had held out for 2 hours under the heavy hands of Dominic Matteo's ruthless underboss. But everyone eventually broke. "I will ask you one last time," Nikolai Matteo said softly, his voice echoing in the cavernous, dimly lit room. He stepped forward, pulling a heavy silver Audemars Piguet lighter from his pocket and flicking it open. The flame illuminated the cold, dead look in his eyes. "Who paid Viktor Rostova to hit the art gallery?" Nikolai spat a wad of blood onto the concrete floor, his chest heaving. You think Victor takes orders? He wants the port's Falcone. He wants the Brooklyn shipping lanes. With you dead, and your new little Rossi bride dead, the territory fractures. It was just business." Matteo's jaw tightened at the mention of Genevieve. He snapped the lighter shut, signaling Dominic. "Wait," Nikolai gasped, his eyes wide with terror as Dominic approached with a heavy wrench. "Wait, the intel." "We had inside intel. Someone told Victor she would be at the gallery. Someone from your side." Matteo froze. The air in the room suddenly turned freezing cold. "Who? I don't know." "A name," Nikolai cried out frantically. "I swear I just know the hit was orchestrated with a rat in your house. They knew her security detail. They knew the timing." Victor laughed about it, said the Falcone Empire was rotting from the inside. Matteo drew his weapon so fast it was a blur, aiming the barrel directly at the space between Nikolai's eyes. A mole. Someone in his inner circle had sold Genevieve to the Russians. The mere thought of it made a murderous rage boil in his blood. Before he could pull the trigger, his encrypted phone vibrated again. It was a text message from a number he didn't recognize. "Check your encrypted email, Matteo. I found the rat." Gee, Matteo's brow furrowed. He shoved his weapon back into his holster and pulled out his phone, accessing his secure offshore email server. There was a single file attached, sent from an untraceable IP address. He opened the document. It was a bank ledger. High-level wire transfers from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, routing through a shell company in Miami and depositing directly into the private accounts of Viktor Rostova. And the signature on the authorizing end of the transfer didn't belong to a Russian. It belonged to Lorenzo Costa, the Miami boss. The same man Genevieve had threatened at the Pierre Hotel. Matteo scrolled further down the document. There were time-stamped security photos hacked from a traffic camera near the gallery, showing one of Matteo's own lieutenants, a man named Silvio, handing an envelope to a known Russian associate hours before the shootout. Silvio, who managed the Miami transport routes. Silvio, who had been bought by Costa to help assassinate Matteo's wife. A grim, terrifying smile spread across Matteo's face. His wife wasn't just beautiful. She was a lethal weapon. While he had been beating answers out of a foot soldier in a basement, Genevieve had hacked into international banking registries from the comfort of their penthouse and handed him the entire conspiracy on a silver platter. Dominic Matteo said, his voice deadly calm. "Put a bullet in him. Then find Silvio. Bring him to the meat-packing district and prepare the men. We are going to Miami tonight." Meanwhile, in the penthouse, Genevieve sat at the massive mahogany desk in Matteo's private study. She was wearing a sleek black turtleneck and tailored trousers, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her encrypted laptop. She had known Costa wouldn't let the insult at the gala slide. When she threatened to expose his Brickell Avenue laundering scheme, she hadn't just been bluffing. She had already owned the files. Once the Russians attacked, she simply connected the dots. She tracked Costa's emergency money movements, finding the massive payout to Brighton Beach. She closed her laptop with a satisfying click, just as the heavy doors to the study swung open. Matteo stood in the doorway. He looked dangerous, exhausted, and thoroughly awestruck. He slowly walked into the room, bypassing the desk to stand directly behind her chair. He placed his large hands on her shoulders, leaning down until his lips brushed her ear. "You hacked a secure Cayman banking server in 3 hours," he murmured, his voice thick with a dark, dangerous kind of pride. 4 hours, actually, Genevieve corrected smoothly, leaning back into his touch. Costa's encryption was surprisingly robust. But he's arrogant. Arrogant men always leave a back door. "You found my mole." Matteo stated his hands, sliding down to trace the collar of her turtleneck. "Silvio is a traitor." "He gave them my itinerary," she replied coldly. "I assume you are dealing with him." "He is already dead," Matteo confirmed, without an ounce of hesitation. "And Costa is next. I'm taking a jet to Miami tonight. By tomorrow morning, the Miami faction will fall under my direct control, and Costa will be at the bottom of the Atlantic." Genevieve turned her chair around to face him. She looked up into his stormy eyes, refusing to back down. "I'm coming with you." Matteo's jaw clenched. "Absolutely not. It's a war zone, Genevieve. I nearly lost you yesterday. I will not put you in the line of fire again." "I am already in the line of fire, Matteo." She stood up, closing the distance between them, jabbing a finger into his chest. "Costa targeted me. Because I humiliated him. This is my fight as much as it is yours. If I stay here hiding like a frightened child, I prove to the 5 families that the Falcone Queen is a weakness. If I stand by your side when you take his empire, I prove that I am untouchable." Matteo stared at her. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who either obeyed him out of terror or manipulated him for power. He had never met someone who demanded to stand shoulder to shoulder with him in the blood and the ash. She wasn't just a Mafia princess. She was a queen who demanded her crown. He reached out, grabbing her by the waist and pulling her flush against his hard body. He looked down into her fierce, beautiful face, his heart hammering with a terrifying, absolute love that he knew would eventually be the death of him. "If we do this," Matteo warned, his voice a low, lethal purr, "there is no going back to the polite, distant wife. You step onto that plane, you embrace the blood, the violence, and the syndicate. You become mine, fully and completely, in every shadow of this life." Genevieve reached up her hands, framing his face, pulling him down until their lips were a breath apart. "I was born in the shadows, Matteo," she whispered against his mouth. "And you have always been mine." Matteo crushed his lips to hers, kissing her with a savage, unyielding possession that sealed their dark pact. The ice was gone, replaced by a raging fire that was about to burn the Miami underworld to the ground. They broke apart, both breathing heavily, their eyes locked in an unbreakable vow. "Get your coat," Matteo ordered, a dark, wicked smile playing on his lips. "We have a flight to catch, and a kingdom to conquer." As they walked out of the penthouse together, their hands intertwined, Genevieve knew the cold, distant Mafia king was dead. In his place stood a man who would tear apart the world for her. The war was just beginning, but as they stepped into the private elevator, surrounded by armed guards and the promise of absolute vengeance. Genevieve realized she had never felt safer in her entire life. The transaction was over. The reign of the Falcone king and queen had just begun. The Gulfstream G640ER tore through the midnight sky, cutting a sleek silver path over the dark expanse of the Atlantic Ocean before beginning its descent into the sweltering heat of Miami. Inside the opulent leather-lined cabin of the private jet, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick with lethal intent. Matteo Falcone sat across the aisle from Genevieve, meticulously loading matte black magazines for his custom tactical rifle. He had shed his ruined designer suit for pitch-black combat fatigues, a heavy Kevlar vest strapped securely across his broad, muscular chest. The transformation was absolute and terrifying. The polished billionaire businessman was completely gone, replaced by the ruthless syndicate boss who had brutally dominated the East Coast underworld for a decade. Genevieve watched his large, calloused hands move with deadly precision, her own heart beating in a steady, dangerous rhythm. She sat perfectly straight in her plush seat, wearing fitted black trousers, a sleek tactical turtleneck, and a lightweight Kevlar vest that Matteo had aggressively forced over her head before they boarded the aircraft. A compact Glock 19 rested securely in a customized leather drop holster on her right thigh. She had been strictly trained to handle firearms by her father's most trusted enforcers when she was 16 at their compound in Sicily, but she had never actually fired a weapon at a living target. She knew with chilling certainty that tonight might irrevocably change that. "We land at Opa-locka Executive Airport in exactly 10 minutes, Matteo announced, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the hum of the jet engines. He racked the slide of his rifle, the sharp, metallic click echoing ominously in the cabin. He looked up, his storm-colored eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, burning intensity. Dominic and a heavily armed strike team of 40 men are already waiting on the tarmac. Costa has barricaded himself inside his sprawling compound on Star Island. He knows we are coming. The element of surprise is entirely gone, Genevieve. This will be a siege. Costa's fortress is heavily reliant on a centralized, state-of-the-art digital security grid. Genevieve replied smoothly, opening her encrypted laptop and bringing up a complex array of scrolling code. He spent $5 million outfitting the perimeter with biometric scanners, automated turret defenses, and reinforced steel gates. But his lead security engineer was lazy. I exploited a back door in their localized network architecture an hour ago. When we are exactly 200 yards from the main gates, I will initiate a localized blackout. The cameras will blind, the gates will unlock, and his automated defenses will completely shut down. Matteo stared at his wife, a dark, wicked smirk slowly spreading across his hardened face. The sheer ruthless brilliance of the woman sitting in front of him was intoxicating. She wasn't just surviving his dark world, she was actively commanding it. You stay inside the armored mobile command center, with Rocco and 5 of my best men. Matteo ordered, his tone brokering absolutely no argument, as he stood up and closed the distance between them. He leaned down, placing a heavy hand on the back of her neck, pulling her forehead against his chest. You guide my men through the blind spots, but you do not step foot outside that armored vehicle. Do you understand me, Genevieve? If I lose you tonight, there is no empire left for me to rule. Just bring Costa to his knees, Matteo, she whispered, wrapping her hands around his thick wrists. I will handle the shadows. You handle the slaughter. 20 minutes later, a terrifying convoy of 10 matte black, heavily armored SUVs rolled silently across the MacArthur Causeway, blending into the sweltering neon-lit Miami night. The humidity was oppressive, thick with the scent of salt water and impending violence. As the convoy approached the exclusive palm tree-lined entrance of Star Island, the sprawling palatial estate of Lorenzo Costa loomed in the distance, bathed in blinding security floodlights. From the reinforced interior of the command vehicle, Genevieve stared at her glowing screens. Her fingers danced rapidly across the keyboard, executing the final sequence of her malicious code. Breach in 3, 2, 1. Lights out. Instantly, the massive Costa estate was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The towering floodlights violently popped and died. The heavy iron gates, previously locked by electromagnetic seals, swung open limply in the humid ocean breeze. "Move, move, move," Dominic roared over the encrypted radio channel. Matteo's strike team swarmed the perimeter like a wave of black shadows. The night erupted into total chaos. The terrifying rhythmic coughing of suppressed submachine guns filled the heavy Florida air. Costa's mercenaries, entirely blinded by the sudden blackout and plunged into panic, fired wildly into the darkness, but the Falcone syndicate operated with devastating surgical precision. Matteo led the charge, a phantom in the night, cutting down Costa's men with ruthless efficiency as he advanced relentlessly toward the main mansion. Inside the SUV, Genevieve rapidly called out enemy positions over the comms, tracking the heat signatures of Costa's guards through a hacked thermal satellite feed. 3 men moving down the western corridor. Dominic. "Matteo, you have 2 shooters flanking you from the second-floor balcony." "Copy that." Queen Dominic replied, his voice laced with adrenaline. Gunfire crackled fiercely through the speaker. Suddenly, a massive, shuddering explosion rocked the eastern side of the compound. The shockwave rattled the heavy armored plating of Genevieve's vehicle. The thermal feed on her laptop aggressively flickered and died. A secondary team of Costa's most desperate men had completely bypassed the main firefight, flanking the Falcone perimeter and zeroing in on the command vehicles parked just outside the gates. Ambush Rocco yelled from the front seat of the SUV, violently throwing his massive body backward as heavy armor-piercing rounds shattered the reinforced windshield, the thick glass spiderwebbed, barely holding together under the ferocious barrage. "They are targeting the comms vehicle." Genevieve's blood ran cold, but panic did not consume her. Survival instinct, sharp and lethal, took over. She slammed her laptop shut and unclipped her seatbelt, drawing the Glock 19 from her thigh holster with a fluid, practiced motion. Rocco kicked his heavy door open, returning fire into the humid darkness. 2 of the Falcone guards outside the vehicle dropped instantly, their body armor failing against the heavy caliber assault. There were at least 6 heavily armed mercenaries advancing rapidly on their position, determined to sever Matteo's communication line. "Get down, Mrs. Falcone." Rocco roared, reloading his weapon behind the engine block. But Genevieve didn't cower on the floorboards. She recognized that Rocco was hopelessly pinned down, taking heavy fire from 2 distinct angles. If she waited to be rescued, they would both die in this sweltering vehicle. She pushed the heavy rear passenger door open, slipping silently into the suffocating humidity and darkness, using the massive tire of the SUV for cover. A mercenary in tactical gear rounded the rear of the vehicle, his weapon raised, entirely focused on Rocco's position at the front. He didn't even notice the Mafia queen crouching in the shadows. Genevieve exhaled slowly, her hands gripping the cold polymer frame of the Glock. She raised the weapon, aligning the glowing tritium sights perfectly with the center of the mercenary's chest. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She squeezed the trigger twice. The loud, sharp cracks of the 9mm rounds pierced the humid air. Both bullets found their mark with lethal accuracy. The mercenary staggered backward, dropping his rifle before collapsing heavily onto the damp pavement, completely neutralized. Over the comms earpiece, Matteo's frantic, enraged voice exploded. Rocco status. I heard unsuppressed pistol fire near the command vehicle. Status. Genevieve pressed the small button on her earpiece, stepping out from behind the vehicle to cover Rocco's blind spot. The command vehicle is secure, Matteo. Keep moving forward. Finish this. Silence stretched over the radio for a fraction of a second before Matteo's voice returned, dark, breathless, and intensely proud. I love you, Genevieve. I'm breaching the main doors now. The opulent, marble-floored foyer of Lorenzo Costa's mansion was entirely slick with blood and shattered crystal. The heavy mahogany double doors had been violently blown off their reinforced hinges by Dominic's explosive breaching charges. Matteo stalked through the smoke-filled corridor, like a predatory apex beast, his dark eyes scanning the opulent surroundings. His combat fatigues were covered in white drywall dust and crimson stains, none of which belonged to him. The resistance had completely crumbled. Costa's remaining mercenaries, realizing the sheer, overwhelming superiority of the Falcone syndicate, were rapidly surrendering, throwing their weapons onto the expensive Persian rugs and dropping to their knees. Matteo aggressively kicked open the heavily carved wooden doors to the master study. Lorenzo Costa was frantically stuffing banded stacks of $100 bills and encrypted hard drives into a black leather duffel bag behind a massive mahogany desk. When the doors crashed open, Costa froze, his face draining of all color. He slowly raised his hands, his arrogant, smug demeanor entirely replaced by absolute whimpering terror. Matteo Costa stammered, stepping back until his spine hit the panoramic bulletproof windows overlooking the ocean. Wait. We can negotiate. We can split the southern seaboard. I'll give you the Miami ports. You can have everything south of Orlando. Matteo didn't speak immediately. He slowly walked across the room, the heavy soles of his tactical boots crunching loudly on broken glass. He stopped directly in front of the desk, his imposing frame casting a terrifying long shadow over the Miami boss. You attempted to assassinate my wife, Matteo, stated his voice, a low, vibrating hum of pure, concentrated rage. The coldness in his eyes was absolute. You conspired with the Russians to spill Rossi blood, and you tried to take the one thing in this miserable world that actually matters to me. There are no negotiations, Lorenzo. There is only a consequence. Costa swallowed hard, sweat pouring down his pale face. If you kill me, the 5 families will go to war. The Commission won't allow you to absorb Miami without a vote. It will plunge the entire East Coast into chaos. The Commission will accept it. A cool, refined voice echoed from the shattered doorway. Matteo turned his head slightly. Genevieve stood in the doorway, her dark hair pulled back, her black tactical clothing dusted with ash. The Glock 19 was still gripped firmly in her hand, her posture impeccable, despite the absolute carnage she had just walked through. Rocco stood menacingly behind her, guarding her flank. Costa stared at her in shock, recognizing the woman he had fatally underestimated at the Pierre Hotel. Genevieve walked slowly into the study, coming to a halt right beside her husband. She didn't look at the blood or the bodies. Her piercing gaze was locked entirely on Lorenzo Costa. 3 minutes ago, I finalized a mass digital transfer of every single one of your offshore shell companies, your Cayman trust funds, and the deeds to your coastal shipping warehouses, Genevieve said, her voice dripping with lethal elegance. The funds have already been permanently routed into a newly established corporate trust, managed entirely by the Falcone syndicate. Furthermore, I forwarded the unredacted ledgers of your illegal human trafficking operations to the heads of the Commission. Costa gasped, his knees buckling slightly. He was entirely ruined. The Commission despises heat. Genevieve continued mercilessly. When they see the massive federal investigations you were about to bring down on their heads, they won't mourn you, Lorenzo. They will send us a thank you gift for removing a liability. You have nothing left to bargain with. You are already a ghost." Matteo stared at his wife, entirely mesmerized. The sheer, calculated brutality of her financial warfare perfectly complemented his physical dominance. They were the perfect, terrifying paradox of the modern Mafia bullets and bank transfers, blood and bites. You hear that Lorenzo Matteo whispered, raising his weapon with a terrifying, steady hand. "The Queen has spoken. Your empire is gone." Costa opened his mouth to scream, but the deafening roar of Matteo's rifle silenced him forever. The Miami boss collapsed heavily to the floor, instantly dead, his blood pooling rapidly over the scattered $100 bills. The deafening silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The war was officially over. The Miami faction had fallen. Matteo lowered his weapon, clicking the safety on. He turned to face Genevieve. The adrenaline was finally beginning to recede, leaving behind the crushing weight of the night's violence. He reached out his large, blood-stained hands, gently framing her beautiful face. His thumbs softly brushed away a smudge of dark ash from her cheekbone. "You shouldn't have left the vehicle," he murmured, though there was absolutely no anger left in his voice, only a profound, overwhelming devotion. "Rocco told me what you did. You took a life tonight, Genevieve. I never wanted this blood on your hands." Genevieve leaned into his touch, her eyes softening as she looked up into the stormy depths of his gaze. "You told me to keep my distance on our wedding night, Matteo. You told me this was just a business transaction. But you lied. You tore apart half of New York to keep me safe, and you burned down Miami to avenge me." She dropped her weapon onto the mahogany desk and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, pulling him down to her level. "I am a Rossi by birth, but I am a Falcone by blood now. I don't want distance. I want the empire, and I want the man who built it." Matteo let out a ragged, emotional breath, closing his eyes as he wrapped his massive arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor. He kissed her with a deep, punishing passion, sealing the unbreakable vow between them amidst the ash and ruin of their enemies. It was a kiss that promised absolute loyalty, terrifying power, and a love forged in the fires of the criminal underworld. 3 months ago, their marriage had been nothing more than a cold, calculated transaction brokered in a boardroom. But as they walked out of the destroyed mansion, together, their hands tightly intertwined, stepping into the warm dawn light of the Florida coast, the truth was undeniable. They were no longer strangers, trapped in a gilded cage. They were the undisputed king and queen of the East Coast, and God help anyone who ever dared to stand in their way again. And that concludes the epic saga of Matteo and Genevieve, the unstoppable king and queen of the East Coast. What started as a cold arranged marriage transformed into an absolutely fierce, bulletproof romance. Did you expect Genevieve to completely dismantle Lorenzo Costa's empire with her laptop and a Glock? Let me know your favorite plot twist in the comments below. If you loved this dark mafia romance and want to hear more thrilling, action-packed stories, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping tale. See you in the next video.